and welcome back to another video, and today we're looking at a scenario where the Indian subcontinent united. This is a rough map of where it is and what the boundaries are, obviously along the Himalayas, some Afghani mountains, and some mountains in northern Myanmar or Burma. Immediately this would become most likely the fourth most important country in the world. It would have the largest economy and one of probably would still be behind Japan and Germany when it comes to economy, but it would be very, very high up there. It is mainly carried by India, who has their entire country in there, but it also has some other very especially populated nations, such as Bangladesh and Pakistan. As I mentioned, it controls northern Myanmar, parts of China, mainly along the border, southern Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, and, well, the Maldives, which are not on this map. Obviously, they're not included because they are not on this map. Let's go ahead and begin. As their main goal is to overthrow China as the main superpower in the region. Obviously, they cannot do this to begin with. They are simply not strong enough to defeat the Chinese. But they can do it quickly, as their first goal is going to be to cut off China from a lot of Middle Eastern trade, at least by land, by invading up into Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. Afghanistan would probably be the hardest here, despite the fact that they're very much so hurt. If you've ever heard the nickname Graveyard of Empires, that is not really sarcastic. That is not a lie. They have been the home to the death of many, many empires, or at least a massive harm or thorn in the side for most empires throughout history who invaded them. Although with Tajikistan falling, Afghanistan would not survive forever. They are simply not powerful enough. Also controls Nepal and Bhutan, forgot to mention that, but that is there as well. From there they would expand this invasion into Turkmenistan, hoping to expand the border with Afghanistan even further. They soon managed to capture Afghanistan's capital and many of the important and most valuable regions in the mountain valleys, which is where a majority of the population lives, but they will continue to fight out in the deserts, where the Indians are very much so struggling to keep pushing. The Turks are cut off from Afghanistan, and that fight is going to go on for a lot longer. Kyrgyzstan, however, will capitulate, and the Indians, who are hoping to secure full control of the Middle East, are next going to invade into Uzbekistan. They managed to capture the capital and much of the important regions within 3 weeks, and by then it is just a large march to fully capitulate the nation. Uzbekistan actually ends up falling first, and very soon after Turkmenistan capitulates. This leaves just Afghanistan, who will attempt to fight on, but in the end, Indian forces will overrun the entire nation, and although there will still be resistance against the Indians have won out here and will annex the entire nation. They will also annex many areas of Central Asia, while setting up a client regime in whatever is left. China is obviously going to be very, very mad at this and may even try and set up their own sphere in the region. But seeing as this is a video about the Indian subcontinent and not China expanding, I'm going to assume that China is going to do absolutely nothing, and the rest of the world, especially Russia, is not going to react at all either. One point where Russia might react slightly is with the Indian invasion of Kazakhstan. They completely topple the Kazakhstani government, and instead of just letting this happen, Russia starts their own invasion, and Kazakhstan is going to be split between the two powers, with India gaining control of southern Kazakhstan, whilst Russia gains control of the north. Russian-Indian relations are actually still doing fairly okay in this scenario. They are most definitely not the worst of enemies, and Russia sees it as very, very, very beneficial if they can keep India on their side. If you have India and China on your side at this point, which is going to be difficult seeing as the two are very much so enemies, you will have over half of the world's manpower at this point, and a massive amount of trading goods. The Russians are actually not going to be the final fight here, so I'm not going to be involving them in much more after this point. But they are still doing their own stuff on the side with Ukraine, etc. Either way, this Indian expansion may not increase their economy significantly or their manpower significantly, but it will increase their size immensely. Annexing this massive portion of Central Asia is probably going to make them surpass Australia when it comes to pure size, if they hadn't already. If I had to guess, they're still a slight amount smaller. Actually, no. They might be a slight amount larger than Brazil. Go ahead and check. They are still slightly smaller than Brazil, but they are most definitely growing, and if you count in their client state, I would say they are doing just fine. They are also not gonna, for this entire time, the, Central Asian nation has been in occupied territory. They're now gonna change it into a further integrated client state, which will have some autonomy but be ruled by the Indian government. From there, they are gonna begin an invasion into Iran, hoping to secure some influence going into the Middle East. At this point, though, I need to give them another enemy, so why not look down here into Arabia with another nation that is greatly considering joining this and decides to form up the Arab nation by annexing Yemen during this schism between Iran and India, along with invading many other nations and uniting with Jordan. Saudi Arabia reforms some shape of an Arabian state that then assists the Indians in the invasion of Iran. This is going to be an absolute massacre as the Saudi Arabians naval invade in the south, whilst also pushing into Iraq. And the Indians start a mass land invasion using their great numbers, even into desert and mountain terrain of Iran. The Iranians will try and fight this, but you can't really fight this absolute superpower. It is not nearly possible. Tehran soon falls, and the rest of what I would call the most important regions up here in the north fall as well. With that, Iran surrenders and a peace treaty will be made, in which India and Arabia actually have some decent relations. They both have much to gain from working together, and almost everything to lose if they go against each other. So they will agree to a pretty fair peace treaty. The Arabians will not be getting very much, as they did not do most of the work, but they still get a large portion of the most important parts of Iran and the oil-rich south and the industrialized north. They also gain all of Iraq and Syria in this peace treaty, fully uniting Arabia into a singular state. This state will be very, very closely aligned with India, as they actually managed to come to a compromise that both were fairly happy with. This will be absolutely fantastic for the Indians, as this new state now controls a massive amount of global oil and other natural resources. As for the rest of Iran, India will be directly annexing it, as they see no point in setting up a small client state in areas bordering Arabia if they can just take it for themselves. We're also going to assume there's no unrest, nothing like that. These lands are now Indian, and nobody is going against that for some reason. India's next campaign, in a hope to encircle China, is not actually going to be into Myanmar. It is going to be maybe not the most difficult, but arguably the most interesting invasion yet. Going into Malaysia. You might be wondering why. They don't border Malaysia. They have fairly okay relations with Malaysia. They really have no reason to, except for the fact that, as I've already mentioned, they are not exactly on the best of terms with China. And by naval invading the Strait of Malacca, at least, yes, that is what it's called, they are cutting off China from the Middle Eastern and African markets, unless Indonesia provides them right of passage, which will probably not happen, as the Indians even make a deal with Indonesia in which Indonesia will be getting the entire island of Borneo in return for basically telling China no, just screwing China over completely and aligning with India on foreign affairs. At this point, India is also pushing to be put onto the UN Security Council to have veto power to stop the Chinese from stopping them, so to say. They also annex Singapore, And now they will begin their invasion of Southeast Asia. At this point, though, as much as I want to rig this in India's favor, China would intervene. Not against India, but instead on the side of India. They do not want to fight the Indians. They are mainly hoping to, stop them. They're mainly hoping to encircle India, similar to what they're doing in real life. Basically, to put them down to the point where China can exert their influence over the region without Indian interference. Both sides would begin an invasion down, China mainly focusing on the Vietnamese coast, managing to capture pretty much the entire nation of Vietnam and parts of Laos and Cambodia, whilst the Indians focus on the Burmese coast. Myanmar will be quick to surrender here. They also quickly link up with their Malaysian client in southern Thailand, and India is the first to reach Bangkok. This won't be enough, as China is pushed into all of the far east of Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and soon enough all states surrender and a peace treaty will be reached. This one, unlike the Arabian or the Russian one, relations were fine and both sides were willing to compromise. This is probably going to be one of the tensest rooms in a while, with both sides trying to get as much as they possibly can, possibly not even for their own benefit, but simply to screw over the other. India would be pushing currently for most of the Burmese coast and most of the Burmese country to be directly annexed. Along with that, they're going to want a large Thai state that will be fully aligned with them. The Malays will also be allowed to push up into the rest of the peninsula. China will see slight expansion down the Vietnamese coast and up in northern Vietnam, whilst a client state will be set up in the rest of Southeast Asia for the Chinese. This really did not go well for China, and they are most definitely not happy about it. They did get all of Vietnam, which is the most important nation in the region, at least I was involved in this, but the Indians saw much larger expansion, and now without any real way to get around this Indian blockade, as I highly doubt Australia or New Zealand would be aiding the Chinese in getting access around the Pacific, China is at the will of the Indians. And that is going to be very apparent in this next war, which is also going to be the last. And that is the Sino-Indian War. Between China and India. Probably going to be one of the deadliest, at least by most forecasts, one of the deadliest wars in human history between the two of the largest and the two most populated states in this world at this time, and for most of history. It is also going to be the largest display of modern weapons yet, as Ukraine is currently the one which is showcasing the most amount of NATO weapons, but this is going to be the largest war in human history since World War II. Much, much larger than the Ukraine war, or whatever is happening in Gaza right now, between the Indians and the Chinese. Immediately, China would have the advantage on most fronts, though. The Indians, although having grown massively and probably being larger than China right now, are most definitely not invulnerable to Chinese losses. China has had years more to prepare for any kind of war with India, and although the Indians have been attempting to militarize quickly, the Chinese had far more time and will actually probably still have a larger military at this time. They began mass invasions along the border into Thailand and into Kazakhstan. They also attempt to push along the Himalayas, but that goes far less well. It goes okay in the Burmese jungle, but overall not great. They also managed to call in a few allies in the form of North Korea and Mongolia, whilst the Russians sanctioned the Chinese choosing to side with the Indians, and the Arabians fully back the Indians, sending them supplies and sending them aid. Then we have a few nations that will be joining this war directly. Obviously Taiwan, who fully rebels, South Korea to continue a form of the Korean War, and Japan, who had been getting very, very close relations with the Indians. They didn't love India taking over the continent, but at this point India is a fully democratic nation who is willing to compromise on certain things with the East Asian powers. Thus they decide to work together to destroy the Chinese menace and put an end to their dominance in Asia. North Korea is first to fall. They may look strong on the world stage, but they really would not last very long, especially with most Chinese troops being wrapped up in Indian campaigns. Soon enough, the Japanese would reach all the way up to the Chinese border, where they would make some slight expansions but soon be stopped. In the south, multiple insurrections would have to be crushed, as many people are looking out of the Chinese system. We also see probably the largest thing that has happened in this war yet, besides the joining of Japan and South Korea, and that is the East Chinese rebellions. In Tibet, most people choose to side with the Indians, who are willing to give them practically full independence, full autonomy. Unlike the Chinese, the Indians are willing to respect just about everything about them, and as long as they are inside of an Indian-led state, and some joint things such as military, it really looks like the better alternative to being with China. The second rebellion happening here is going to be in Xinjiang, where the people once again rise up against Chinese rule. This allows the Indians to do a sweeping counteroffensive into Central Asia and northern India. The Chinese are still doing just fine in Southeast Asia, where they are continuing to make progress, but in India they are slowly starting to lose. They do win the key city of Bangkok, though, giving them access to most of Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, the Indians have crushed eastern China. With the people entirely on their side, they have managed to win out completely, and that is now a massive border for both sides. The Indians choose to focus on capturing Mongolia, as that will be by far the easiest target, and that happens easily, as once they capture Ulaanbaatar, all of Mongolia capitulates. They then decide that they have gained enough Chinese territories and that pushing any further would be too difficult. So they decide to push into their own lands. After over a year of being occupied by China, these lands are fully ready to go back to India, as they see it as the far better alternative to Chinese rule. Bangkok is recaptured, and in southern Southeast Asia, the Indians are pushing back significantly, pushing into southern Vietnam and capturing many, many territories. If you're wondering how they are doing this well, China has no economy. In our world, they have the second most powerful and second largest economy, and they could crush most of the world if they wanted to. But in this world, it is looking very, very different. India has overtaken them as the factory of the world, with all that new cheap labor coming in instead of China. And along with that, India has far better relations with Western powers, Middle Eastern powers, even some African nations, and Russia, along with Europe. The Chinese are also practically fully cut off from the global market, as the Americans practically aid the Indians with their allies in Australia and the deal with Indonesia, allowing them to fully embargo the Chinese. Even if this wasn't the case, a Japanese, Taiwanese, and Southeast Asian blockade could still take place, and combining all the navies of the three great powers involved on the red side, it would be feasible that the Chinese would be cut off and slowly but surely destroyed. The Indians decide to focus on southern China, where many people are looking to help them, are looking to rebel against the Chinese overlords, mainly thanks to Taiwanese and Japanese campaigns, spreading immense amounts of propaganda amongst the southern Chinese people. This helps them immensely as they capture the entire region, including Hong Kong. From there, China does manage to push back, though. They haven't been doing much, but they managed to push back in Manchuria, push back in the south, and they even commit to a small campaign in the center, which does much better than they expected, as the Indian lines were very, very fragile here. They are focusing much of their effort in the south. Either way, this is looking very, very bad for China, and people in Manchuria and down in southern China are starting to look for alternatives. In the south, the Indians, or especially Japanese, started another major offensive, capturing the entire region and the jungle region, in which the Chinese suffer mass casualties. I'm not saying the Indians didn't, but the Indians suffered far less casualties than the Chinese did here in southern China, which is where China was hoping to pull this back. Along with North Korea being fully recaptured and a push into Manchuria being made, the writing is clear. China loses their largest and arguably most important city of Shanghai, and soon enough, even Beijing is on the verge of falling. They do manage mass counteroffensives along the border as they conscript every man, woman, and child to fight, but this is really not doing much more than assuring their eventual collapse, as the Indians use the advantage of Chinese focus on the south to push up north, hoping to link up with South Korea and Japan. Soon enough, all of Manchuria falls, and China is down to just their coastline. Soon enough, the Battle of Beijing will begin, which leads to a surprisingly mainly East Asian victory, as the Indians have been busily pushing into the center. Although at this point, once again, China is completely dead. They have no money, their people don't even want to live there anymore. And with the mass conscription sending millions of Chinese off to die, the people are really sick of the war, including in Japan and India, which is where a compromise is made. At this point, most communist leaders had been killed, leading more moderate elements to take control of the Chinese nation. These more moderate people, still not exactly Indian aligned, but more moderate, agree to a sort of peace. The Indians will now take full control of this Chinese vassal, re-expanding it into southern China. They will also annex a small part of Mongolia, and especially going into Xinjiang and Tibet. The Tibetan rebels were told that they would get independence, and this isn't too far off from the truth, as what ends up happening is that Tibetan and Xinjiang areas are closely tied to the Indian government, having the same military, foreign affairs, even many economical things, but they are given autonomy to make local laws, etc. Mongolia is slightly expanded into China, mainly to punish the Chinese, and are turned into an Indian client state. Manchuria is turned into a joint South Korean-Japanese effort, while South Korea annexes the north. Along with this, a piece of southern China is directly occupied by Indian troops. That leads to the end of the war and major stability increase in all of Asia. There's now obviously just this one main power that you can go to for just about everything, and that is India. I'm going to leave them colored in like this, but this is practically a part of the Indian nation. The Mongolian part is also added to the Turkic part. China will still not be fully under the control of the Taiwanese government, as it is far too vast an area for the small island, but over time they will start to influence the area until eventually it will become fully integrated into this new system. With that, war in Asia will be over. Maybe a war with Russia could be possible, but it would take a while, as Indian-Russian relations are still surprisingly good, despite the fact that India has shown its better side and sided with the Western powers. I am going to end it here, but I hope you enjoyed. This is now an absolute superpower, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye.